Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of Boss Economics World, YouTube's premier, unapologetically cutting show, where we slice and dice the economics landscape like it was your neighborhood pizza, except we leave no slice untouched by the uncomfortable truths the government tries so hard to hide. Today, we've got a juicy lineup for you, because, guess what? We're diving into the narrative the mainstream media, surprise surprise, wants to sideline, the reality behind America's roaring economy, as told on the eve of yet another pivotal presidential election. Let's peel back the curtain, shall we? Pack your financial seatbelts, we're in for a ride full of contradictions, political gymnastics, and, yes, numbers that smell too good to be true. Bubble of butterflies, the election-time economic mirage. Snap your fingers, people. It's election time again, and you know what that means, sugar-coated economic numbers. You've heard the headlines, I'm sure, U.S. growth is robust. Unemployment is low. The American consumer soldiers on. Oh, really? This politically curated message smells more like a desperate PR strategy than an actual walk through reality. Let's break it down from point to surface. The third quarter shows us that America's GDP growth surged beyond 4%, right? In a simple-minded world, everyone's clapping. The economy's fantastic, it's running like a well-oiled machine, right? Wrong. Quarterly growth alone is no proof of long-term prosperity. Let's unpack this like a stack of those misleading economic reports. Sure, we've been seeing solid GDP growth in 2023, and the unemployment rate seems to be hanging low in the range of 3.6% to 3.8%. But we must ask, at what cost are we seeing these numbers? The labor market is weakening beneath the surface, job growth has nearly slowed to a crawl. In October, only 12,000 jobs were added. That's the worst we've seen since 2020. And part of that was due to temporary factors like strikes and hurricanes. When we adjust for these factors, the job market doesn't feel robust, it feels like it's hobbling along, soft-footed. But there's more. Let's dive into wages. While nominal wages have been rising 4% to 5% in recent months, inflation has been right on its heels. And that's after inflation has supposedly cooled. For every slight bump in our paychecks, we've faced an equivalent, if not larger, gut punch from rising prices. Wage growth may have outpaced inflation since mid-2022, but let's not forget the 7.4% inflation peak of 2022. Inflation has just recently dipped down to 2.1% in September. Yet people aren't blind. Just because the rise in prices slowed doesn't mean consumers feel any relief. Inflation, the unwelcome dinner guest who overstays its welcome, except it sticks like gum on your shoe. For a while, inflation was skyrocketing. 7%. 8%. The Biden administration saw inflation levels unmatched since the 80s. And politicians, of course, as they always do, came out with their honeyed remarks, we're controlling inflation. It's returning to reasonable levels. But here is where numbers can mislead. Prices haven't come down. They've just risen more slowly. Yet to the average American, you don't feel a whisper of this so-called disinflation. You and I still walk into a grocery store and watch as inflation eats through your weekly budget. Eggs, gas, and rent, hardly any of these have felt the cooling touch of inflation reduction. 2022 saw an astronomical rise, crossing $5 per gallon as a national average. Since then, prices retreated but hovered around $3.60 to $4 through 2023, meaning we cannot ignore that the previously inflated high base is pushing our optimism down without an actual rollback of cost to consumers. If we track overall CPI, Consumer Price Index, July of 2021 saw core inflation grind at 3.9%, which zoomed above 9% in June of 2022. Companies began passing higher labor and input expenses on to middle-class consumers. Voila! A misery multiplier in action. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, we have the housing market, or should I call it, no-go zone, for the average American buyer. Who can afford a home today? With mortgage rates rocketing past 7.5%, buying a house becomes a mythical aspiration for most young workers or families. Forget dreaming, start renting for the rest of your life because even high-earning middle-class Americans are cringing every time they see housing prices. The real estate issue tears gaping wounds in the fabric of America's booming economy. Homeownership rates are down, especially among younger populations who, in the 80s and 90s, would have entered the property market by this stage in their careers. Now we've got millions of potential first-time buyers priced out indefinitely. Home affordability is in crisis mode, and this very situation negates the narrative perpetuated by both Trump and Biden as champions of economic recovery. Now, I'm sure you've heard folks from both sides blabber on about the post-pandemic recovery being exceptional in the U.S. That's mostly true in a relative sense. America's economy did indeed outperform other developed nations in post-pandemic years, thanks to massive injections of stimulus, which skyrocketed household balance sheets, asset prices, and overall productivity. But let me ask you this, how sustainable is that model really? In 2020 and 2021, the government dispersed over $5 trillion in economic relief funds, stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, and forgivable loans. Sure, this artificial infusion fueled consumer spending, but now pass into 2024, and America is left swamped in debt, both private and public. Household savings, which jumped thanks to those stimulus checks, have since evaporated under high prices. As of mid-2024, the U.S. federal debt is pushing $33 trillion, or over 125% of GDP. According to current projections, IMF, November 2023, by 2028, this will bloat to well over 116% of GDP under Trump's tax cuts revival plan, or potentially 109% under Kamala Harris's slightly more conservative fiscal policy. And speaking of taxes, Harris's latest clout move included vague promises of expanding tax credits while issuing a ban on price gouging, really? As if regulations alone could stem inflation magically. Come on, economic laws don't bend to such manipulation, Kamala. Let's confront the final elephant in the room, the exploding wealth divide. You see, despite solid corporate profits, which, by the way, have seen 22 consecutive quarters of growth, all Americans aren't reaping the fruits of Bidenomics. A booming stock market, yes, we heard the sound bites about record market highs, has fattened the portfolios of high-income and wealthy households whose substantial asset holdings keep inflating. But here's the rub. More than 40% of Americans own little to no stock. Those without skin in the finance game face the same unforgiving interest rates on car loans, mortgages, personal debt, and rising credit card delinquencies. Contemporary data from Federal Reserve Economic Data, FRED, shows American household debt sitting at a heart-clenching $17 trillion across credit cards, mortgages, and other debt. So, the stock market and housing boom that lifts household net worth? It's not for everyone. Our top 10% net worth households hold about 69% of all household wealth, U.S. Federal Reserve 2023 surveys. Social inequality has only been exacerbated under both Trump and Biden, and now Joe Blickenstaff in Alabama can only tiptoe around economic landmines while Wall Street yuppies pop champagne. Ladies and gents, the government is feeding you economic success stories, with selective data while the iceberg lurks below, acute inequality, an overleveraged debt-ridden economy built on stimulus steroids, and a fading promise of affordable homeownership. The U.S. economy hasn't roared back like some lion, it's prancing around like a sheep in wolf's clothing, unwilling to confront the specter of long-term instability and elitism this era will leave behind. As November 2024 casts its shadow, voters are once again caught between this bizarre twin reality, surface-level prosperity mixed with a deeper inventory of unsustainable imbalances. Whether it's booming corporate profits, inflated stock market gains, or low unemployment, much of this touted prosperity is only skin deep. Beneath it bubbles a tsunami of debt, inflation fatigue, housing unaffordability, and a gnawing sense of inequality. Let's pivot to the narrative surrounding consumer spending, the engine of American economic resilience in this time of crisis. Yes, it's true, consumption accounts for nearly 70% of U.S. GDP, and Americans have continued spending, even through the turmoil of inflation and rising interest rates. But should this be celebrated? What if persistent consumer spending isn't a sign of strength but an act of desperation? In September alone, U.S. retail sales increased 0.7%, following strong gains in the previous months, BEA data, 2023. Some have taken this as a sign of robust demand and consumer optimism. The truth is more sobering. Americans are increasingly turning to credit cards to maintain their spending habits, taking on high-interest debt in the face of income stagnation and a rising cost of living. The total revolving credit, the kind mostly associated with credit card debt, has surpassed $1.2 trillion by mid-2023, reaching all-time highs, Federal Reserve data. As Americans dig deeper into their credit reserves, interest rates on that debt have climbed as well, standing at over 20% for many credit card holders. Guess what comes next? An inevitable reckoning when rising debt burdens collide with potential job losses or a cooldown in the job market. The savings rate is another headache. After surging to 33.8% in April 2020, due to government aid and the halt in consumer activity during lockdown, the savings rate has plummeted below 3.4% as of the latest data in 2023. This is unsustainable. Households have been dipping into savings and driving up credit card balances to maintain consumption in an economy designed to extract every extra penny from their pockets. It paints a precarious portrait of an overleveraged consumer base keeping the GDP alive out of sheer necessity, not confidence. Let's not forget the role of the Federal Reserve, because, while we often blame politicians directly, the way the central bank manages its monetary policy shapes our daily realities. The Fed's aggressive interest rate hikes in 2022 and 2023 successfully tamed headline inflation, but they've brought sectoral imbalances, particularly in housing and small business growth. Mortgage rates surged dramatically, even surpassing 8%, turning once affordable homes into expensive dreams for millions. Importantly, rising borrowing costs are pressuring businesses, too, even large corporations, with corporate borrowing rates reaching decade-high levels. In one breath, the Federal Reserve tries to maintain price stability and prevent inflation from surging again by keeping interest rates high. But in doing so, they're kneecapping core economic functions like credit availability for consumers and making life incredibly difficult for small and medium enterprises, SMEs, the backbone of the American economy. The Fed Governor, Jerome Powell, announced that interest rates would likely remain elevated until inflation sustainably meets the 2% target, a goal that risks pushing the economy into a hard landing, i.e., a recession. But here's the irony: the entire post-pandemic recovery, from lockdown to present, is predicated on low-interest debt-fueled spending. And when that spigot dries up, what do you think remains? We had tried our best to print ourselves out of a recession during the pandemic, but now we've backed ourselves into a corner, and the Fed's tightening policies are suffocating consumer spending and business expansion. Like a seesaw with no end, these actions further exacerbate the income inequality gap, fodder for political turbulence. Now, on to the political candidates eyeing the economy like hawks in this pre-election frenzy. We've got Donald Trump, wielding nostalgia for the great economy America had under pre-pandemic conditions, and Kamala Harris, promising to build a more equitable economy while also introducing targeted tax breaks and expanded social spending. Trump paints Bidenomics as the worst economic mismanagement in living memory, citing high inflation and debt surges while lauding his own pre-2020 economy, characterized by tax cuts and deregulation. But the reality of his past policies led to massive shortfalls in government revenue, leaving the U.S. staring at steep deficits ever since. Let's not forget that Trump's 2017 corporate tax cut, from 35% to 21%, while initially hailed as a market booster, contributed to government revenue loss to the tune of nearly $1.5 trillion over 10 years. That sugar rush fueled asset bubbles and widened wealth inequality rather than the promised sustainable growth. Moreover, his administration encouraged regulatory rollback in areas like financial services, all while ballooning debt has been left as a forward time bomb for future taxpayers. On the flip side, Kamala Harris has doubled down on populist economic ideas, such as expanding the child tax credit, seen by many as a boost to consumer spending, and banning price gouging. How exactly will she enforce that in industries like healthcare or housing remains unclear. While she's pushing for progressive taxes, and claims more regulation on corporate monopolies, will these measures truly outpace inflationary pressures created by broken supply chains and sluggish wage growth? Her proposals, though dressed with a bow of social equity, are unlikely to close the fiscal gap or balance the overwhelming deficit trend. Her platform attempts to cultivate a middle ground but seems poorly positioned to curb national debt, which is projected to breach 99% of GDP in 2024, a frightening balance sheet that looms over every future policy decision. No matter who wins the election, whether it's Trump with his promises of tax cuts and nationalistic spending, or Harris with her platform of equity and progressive fiscal ideas, the next president will face critical long-term challenges. These won't be easily swept under the rug. First and foremost, debt sustainability. Public debt levels approaching 125% of GDP render the U.S. extremely vulnerable. The kind of fiscal imbalances we're staring at will require dramatic adjustments. Interest rates on U.S. debt alone could eat up a bigger chunk of the federal budget. What that means for public services, national defense, and welfare programs is undeniable. Tough decisions ahead, with spending cuts and potential tax hikes. Secondly, the global economy itself is at a crossroads. America continues to outperform other advanced nations post-pandemic, but geopolitical tensions, especially with China, could rupture the global supply chains we've become increasingly reliant on. Coupled with a rising trend toward deglobalization and trade protectionism, it's not hard to envision some rocky years ahead for America's role in global trade. And if we add climate risks? Oh boy, the escalating costs of climate change adaptation and mitigation will heap more pressure on already strained budgets. Wildfires, floods, and hurricanes, the economic cost of these disasters has been climbing steadily, and this will hammer local economies hardest. Insurance premiums are rising, and as federal programs buckle under the strain, climate refugees and large-scale displacement will introduce a whole new range of socio-economic problems. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the truth that they don't want you to see. We are flying high on the fumes of an unsustainable, debt-ridden, wealth-concentrated economy. This so-called booming economy is a mirage. It's fragile. It's teetering. The rich get richer, the poor face higher costs, and our broken political promises pile up like IOUs to the next generation. The reality that neither Kamala Harris nor Donald Trump would admit is that their policies are short-term band-aids on an economy that is facing serious structural challenges. Whether it's interest rates locking people out of homeownership, inflation slowly draining the purchasing power of the middle class, or the unresolved chasm between asset-rich elites and indebted families, the problems are too big to be solved by temporary tweaks. What America needs is a deep recalibration, a rethink of economic policy beyond the surface-level GDP statistics and unemployment numbers politicians love to flaunt. Only time will tell how these pressing issues get resolved, but one thing is clear: electing leaders based on political narratives rather than clear-eyed economic realities will keep us on this merry-go-round of superficial success and deep, systemic failure. Remember, when they say the economy's doing well, it pays to ask, for whom? Subscribe if you're tired of the fluff and want to know what's really going on. Drop a comment below. Where do you think the real pinch of the economy is happening? Let's shake off the sugarcoating and dig into the real meal.